So we can now close this window in the design mode and minimize it. And the next step here is to actually download new versions of the main window, header and implementation file. Of course, the location of these files in our current project is under source subfolder. So lab 12 source. And so these two files are just about to be replaced with new versions. So let's make sure that we download these files directly into this subfolder. So we'll just right click and save link as, and when the dialog box comes up, just hit enter and save and confirm that you want to replace. And likewise the implementation file also. Now it's already pointing to the same location, so just make sure that you don't give it new name. Just make sure that you replace the actual old version. We don't need a file with a new name. We're replacing the existing one. Okay, so now we should be able to compile the program. So let's try it. Build. And apparently one change that we have to make in our implementation file is that we need to include input-output stream so that we can start tracing results of button selections. So I'm just adding this IO stream header to the main window implementation file. Okay, so with that we should be able to build. Okay, looks good. And when we start the application, you can see that the initial state of our radio buttons is that none of them is selected. Well, sometimes it can be okay, but also it may be a good idea to actually present the user with a default choice. So that is something that we could modify in this initial setup, just to make sure that one of these controls is selected. Nevertheless, if we start clicking around, you see that the clicks generate tracing messages which seem to correspond to 0, line, 1 is circle, and 2 is rectangle. So apparently there is this type of enumeration in our application which creates these unique constants corresponding to 3 of our buttons. So that's the initial setup. So let's start examining the code. And let's start with the header file of our main window. And of course it's the new file that we just downloaded from this handout. And this is where these unique IDs are generated. So there is radio ID, line, circle, and rectangle, and enumeration simply creates integer constants that have by default unique values, and they're constants, and they are assigned values 0, 1, and 2. So this is where the 0, 1, and 2 originate, because we have an enumeration in our main window.h. Of course, we still recognize our main window, which derives itself from fluid window, and the show member function. And now we also have a handler for the radio button clicks. And you see that I'm expecting that these unique IDs are passed to this click by this integer value. So there's a callback for the radio button that we also define. So this is the static callback, which will be called by all of these buttons. Let's now resize this and examine the implementation. Okay, so we're done looking at the header file. So we observed this static radio button. Oh, and perhaps the other thing to see here is that we also create a helper class That's called a RadioSelector. So the RadioSelector connects button ID with the window to which that radio button belongs. And so this is why it stores a window pointer to the main window, right? So pointer to our main window is stored inside RadioSelector. So RadioSelector is just a helper class that we use. And this RadioSelector has the constructor that takes window and button ID. So apparently for each button we'll be constructing one selector. And besides that, there is a select function, which apparently we should be able to identify in our implementation file. So let's take a look at the functionality of these two items, basically the constructor. So what the constructor does, it's using a constructor initializer list to basically initialize this pointer and button ID with the parameter that were given to the constructor. And select, the selector, selector's select member function, apparently delegates the call to click radio button with the button ID, which was already stored by the button. Okay, so this is our helper class that allows to kind of delegate a call into the main window and call click radio button handler with the specific ID.